Hi guys, it's Colleen with Made for Mermaids. Welcome to day 3 of our Sierra Sew Along. On day 1, we put together our pattern pieces and cut out our fabric. And yesterday, day 2, we put together our tank bodice options. So today is the flutter sleeve bodice options, or if you decided you wanted to match it with another sleeve, we will tackle those today. So the first option we're going to do is the full bodice. Then we will work on the cutouts, and then we will work on the open back bodice. We're going to start with steps 2 and steps 3, and that is sewing up your center seams and sewing up your shoulder seams. If you want to stabilize your bodice seams with clear elastic, now is the time that you would do it. You'll just place the elastic a 1/4 inch in and attach it as you're running it through the serger or your sewing machine if that's what you're using. Once you finish the center seams for both your main bodice and your lining, you'll want to attach your shoulder seams, so you'll match shoulder seam to shoulder seam with right sides together, and again that's a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we'll stitch that up. You may want to make a note of which is the back and which is the front. If you want to do that, you can just put a little clip at the center seam. Once you've sewn up your center seam and your shoulder seam, you'll want to match up all 4 of those points with right sides together and either pin or clip them, and then you'll finish your neckline with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After you've finished up your neckline, you can go ahead and flip your bodice right side out. And if you want to, you can baste your arm side together before we attach the flutter sleeve, but you don't have to. And we won't need to burrito roll the arm side since it's not going to be an enclosed seam. We'll finish it up when we finish the flutter sleeves. So that makes this option just a little bit faster. To work on the side seams. So you're going to match main front bodice to main back bodice. And you can go ahead and pin or clip those side seams together. Just be sure that it's actually the side seams you're pinning or clipping and you're not catching the bottom seam or anything like that. I know, especially with these little pieces, sometimes it's hard to make sure that you have all the right pieces pinned or clipped together. And then we'll do the same for the lining pieces. So you'll pin or clip the back lining to the front lining, and we are going to clip along the side seams. We'll go ahead and stitch those side seams up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once your side seams are sewn up, you can turn it right side out. And you'll notice that your side seams are enclosed, but your bottom seam and your armholes are not enclosed yet. Well, not finished yet. They won't be enclosed. Sorry. For the flutter sleeves, you're going to take the short ends and we will sew it together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And the great thing about these flutter sleeves is there's no gathering involved. So you get that nice little flutter or ruffly look without the gather. So repeat it for the opposite side. And then this is where the basting makes it a little bit easier, but it'll work fine without basting the sleeves too. You just may want a few more clips. So turn your bodice right side out, or inside out I mean, so that the lining is showing. And you're just going to pin or clip your sleeve in. So your sleeve will be right side, touching the right side of the bodice. So match the seam with the side seam of your bodice piece. And then you'll want to clip or pin the notch at the top to your shoulder seam. And then we'll stitch all 3 of those layers using a 1 inch seam allowance. If you want, you can clip it in a few more spots, but I usually just clip those 2 spots. So if you want to turn that right side out just to check it, you can see you have a nice little flutter sleeve there. And we will repeat it for the opposite side. So go ahead and turn it back inside out. And we've already done the seam here. So again, we'll match the seam to the side seam of your bodice. So now you'll have your 2 flutter sleeves finished. And we'll go ahead and work on the cutout bodice next. For our cutout bodice option with our flutter sleeves, we're going to sew up the center seams and the shoulder seams again using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then after that, we'll finish up the neckline. finish up my center seams. Now I'm going to work on my shoulder seams, attaching right sides to right sides. And again, if you wanted to stabilize with clear elastic, this would be a great spot to place some of that elastic. Even if you don't do it in the center seams, the shoulder seams is always a good option. So you'll match up your neckline at the shoulder seam and, well, both shoulder seams and your center seams. And then we will sew the neckline using a 1/2 inch seam allowance again. And this is where you'll see one of the times it's really important to take accurate seam allowances, because if you don't take exact seam allowances on all of the pieces, they won't line up correctly here. So it's always important to watch your seam allowances. It doesn't always seem like a tiny little bit is going to make a big difference, but by the time you finish the garment, if you've had seam allowances that were a tiny bit off the whole time, then it does make a big difference at the end. So we sew that up using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and turn your pieces right side out. Finish up our side seams. So you can take your front bodice and sort of flatten it out so that both right sides are facing up. And then you'll just pull your back bodice over to meet it. So you can see my main bodice side seams are matched up on both sides. And then we'll do the same for the lining, and make sure right sides are together, and make sure that you're matching the right pieces up together, that you're not accidentally matching up cutouts or anything like that. And we'll sew these up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then our next step will be those little cutouts. So we'll go ahead and sew this up. Oops. That was just a tiny bit off. Now that we've sewn up our side seams, we're ready to do our cutouts. So go ahead and turn your bodice right side out. And if you watched yesterday, you know that I like to, when I'm doing a burrito roll, I like to clip the two sides that I want to meet. So I want this side and this side to finish together. Okay, and it's a little bit more challenging this way because, as you can see, the side seams are already finished. So you still are going to need to burrito roll it, and then you'll take the right side of your bodice and then the lining side of the bodice to kind of wrap up your burrito roll, and then we'll clip the side seams where they meet. And you can clip each end of the cutout. And you'll just want to push all that extra fabric out of the way. So this is what it should look like, and you'll see all the other fabric, the rest of the bodice is rolled up in there. And the cutouts are done with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So one last burrito roll for this version. Again, you can place clips on the sides that you want to meet together. Just it makes it a little bit easier. And now we'll do the same thing. So we will roll from the top of the bodice down. And when we get pretty close, go ahead and wrap that side around it so that your clips meet each other. You can pull those serger threads kind of out of the way. Clip at the side seams where they meet, and then you can clip either end of the cutout. And then we'll sew that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you can go ahead and turn the whole thing right side out, just to double check it, and then we'll turn it back inside out again so we can attach our flutter sleeves. At this point, your bodice should look like this, where the neckline is finished, the side seams are enclosed, and your cutouts are also enclosed. You should have the armholes still unfinished and the bottom of your bodice still unfinished. So if all of your seams look good, you can go ahead and turn it back inside out, and we will work on the flutter sleeves. So just like the full bodice, you'll stitch up the short end with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I like to leave a pretty good tail so that it gives me a lot to work with. I can weave it back through and then tack it down just so it doesn't come undone. I'm going to place them inside the bodice, matching up your flutter sleeve seam with your side seam of your bodice. Go ahead and place a clip there. And then match the notch on the flutter sleeve to the shoulder seam of your sleeve, or of your bodice, I mean. And then do the same for the other side. And we'll stitch that up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we'll do the same for the other side. flip it right side out. And I'll trim that off. And your cutout bodice with flutter sleeves is all set to go. So we can set that to the side, and now we will work on our open back bodice. For the open back bodice, again, we'll start with the center seams and the shoulder seams, and we'll do that with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we'll attach at the shoulder seams, and that is also a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For the open back bodice, after you've done the center seams and the shoulder seams, you're going to want to finish up the neckline. And just like with the other ones, we'll match up center seam, shoulder seams, and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and turn your bodice right side out. And we'll finish up our open back. So lay it out. And this is a fairly big seam to do, so your burrito roll doesn't have to be super tight, but you still want to roll it toward your back bodice, and then we'll kind of sandwich it in between the back bodice pieces. So the part that I'm clipping is the bottom of the back bodice lining and the bottom of the back bodice main fabric. And the burrito roll that's rolled up in there is the rest of the bodice. So we'll sew that up using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we also need to finish our cutouts, so we will do the same little burrito roll. And I'm just going to quickly clip the cutouts that I'm attaching so that I can keep them straight. So you'll burrito roll toward the cutout, wrap the cutout around your burrito roll, and then we'll stitch that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can turn that right side out. And then we'll do the opposite side. So you can put your clips there again. And then we will burrito roll toward those clips, toward that cutout that we're stitching up. Wrap your cutout around that burrito roll. And then we'll stitch that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then go ahead and turn it right side out. And then we'll finish up the side seams. You're going to want to match up your bottom seam with your cutout seam with right sides together. So kind of the easiest way to do it is just to turn it inside out. And it's not quite a burrito roll, but you're kind of meeting them with right sides together with all the rest of your bodice kind of tucked in there. And sew those side seams up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can turn that right side out, and you'll see that now your side seam is all finished up, and the front has a little bit of a cutout, and the back is just the open back. So when we do the opposite side, you'll do the same thing. So you'll match right side to right side, and your lining should be touching your lining, and your main fabric should be matched up to your main fabric with your side seam, or with your seam matching up too. And you'll sew that up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you can turn it right side out just to check all your seams, and then we'll flip it back inside out to attach our flutter sleeves. So you can see our open back is finished up. Our little cutout on the side is finished up. And we are ready to attach our flutter sleeves. So go ahead and turn it back inside out. For the flutter sleeves, go ahead and stitch up that short end with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Match up your seam with your side seam on your bodice. Make sure that the right sides are touching the right side of your flutter sleeve and the right side of your main fabric. And then once those are matched up, you'll match the notch to the shoulder seam. And sew that up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and repeat for the opposite side. So you'll match up the flutter sleeve seam with your side seam on your bodice. And then we will match the notch to the shoulder seam at the top with right sides together, and sew it on up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. turn it right side out so you can check it over. Make sure your sleeves are looking good. And you are all set. Officially covered all 6 bodice options, and we are ready for day 4, which is attaching our waistband. So we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.